Reflecting on the ancient world inevitably leads to surprising historical paradoxes. Among the numerous city-states of Hellas, Sparta, despite its relatively modest population, undoubtedly stood out as one of the most powerful and renowned. This situation naturally caused bewilderment. How could such a sparsely populated city achieve such unprecedented influence and military prowess? However, delving into the unique institutions of Spartan society quickly dispelled any surprise, replacing it with admiration for their distinct logic. It is with these words that the foundational work known as the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians begins. This invaluable text was penned by Xenophon in the early 4th century BC. An Athenian by birth, Xenophon had the unique opportunity to spend several years among the Spartans, which allowed him to leave behind the most complete and reliable surviving account of their extraordinary way of life. Without his insightful observations and detailed records, our knowledge of Sparta's peculiar customs would be negligible, hidden beneath the veil of time and myth. But what exactly were these unusual customs that so astonished their contemporaries? At its core, ancient Sparta built its entire social structure with a singular goal: to achieve maximum military effectiveness at any cost. Their legendary discipline, honed to perfection, and their unprecedented ability to mobilize all male citizens for war allowed this small city-state to rise and become the undisputed dominant land power in all of Greece. Even though other Greek polis spoke the same language and worshipped the same gods, they viewed Sparta with almost alien astonishment, seeing it as something foreign and incomprehensible. So, what specific Spartan institutions shaped this unique civilization, and why did Xenophon consider them the true source of Sparta's unparalleled strength? The answers to these questions lie in the depths of their self-sacrificing and austere existence, revealing the mysteries of ancient power. Sparta operated as a diarchy, meaning it had two kings, each hailing from a different royal family. These monarchs held equal power and governed concurrently. According to Spartan founding myth, Heracles himself arrived from overseas with his followers, conquering the land that would become Sparta and enslaving the local Greek population. He then granted this territory to his twin descendants, Eurysthenes and Proclus. It was their descendants who laid the foundations for the Agiad and Eurypontid royal dynasties, which jointly ruled the city for over 700 years. Thus, according to the history they told themselves, the Spartans considered themselves foreign occupiers. This aspect was a central element of Spartan identity, so significant that they perceived any non-Spartan as a potential threat. This attitude extended even to their own slaves. The descendants of the enslaved Greeks were called Helots. Helots significantly outnumbered the Spartans. The exact ratio is unknown, but estimates range from 3-1 to 7-1. In any case, they were significantly more numerous. Because of this, Spartans lived in a state of constant anxiety, fearing that the enslaved Greeks would one day unite and rebel against their foreign masters. The Spartans almost believed that if their city were ever to fall, the fatal blow would come from a Helot uprising. The reason Spartan society endured the constant burden of stress associated with controlling the Helots was that this large-scale enslavement generated colossal amounts of wealth. When each Spartan male reached maturity, the city of Sparta allocated him a plot of public land and a contingent of Helots to cultivate it. The wealth produced by each such farm was so substantial that it effectively transformed every Spartan citizen into a landowning aristocrat. In other words, they were so well provided for that none of them were forced to labor for their sustenance. Nevertheless, even with such extensive state-owned lands subsidizing the Spartan way of life, private property still existed. Why is this circumstance so significant? Because Spartan inheritance law was so radical that it horrified and astonished all other Greeks. When a Spartan man died, his public land allotment reverted to the state, but his private property passed to his wife, not his son. At first glance, this might seem like a minor distinction, but it must be considered that the premature death of husbands was an exceptionally common occurrence in such a militarized society. Many of these women, inheriting their husbands' fortunes, dedicated the rest of their lives to growing their initially modest assets into significantly larger ones. Ultimately, when these wealthy women died, their landholdings were passed down in equal shares to their children, both male and female. This was the radical nature of the system. Imagine a wealthy young woman with an inherited fortune marrying an equally well-off young man. If this young man met his end in battle, which was a very common occurrence, his wife became the full heir to all his property, transforming from merely wealthy to extremely rich. Subsequently, she would have her entire life not only to multiply her accumulated assets, but also to ensure their transfer to her descendants, both sons and daughters. In other words, wealthy women tended to foster the emergence of even more wealthy women. These affluent ladies, in turn, married wealthy men, and in eras when a significant number of husbands died in their prime, this created a snowball effect, steadily increasing the concentration of wealth. These extraordinarily wealthy women were sometimes referred to as Spartan heiresses. The renowned philosopher Aristotle noted in his writings that in his era, almost 40% of all Spartan territory was owned and managed by a narrow circle of exceptionally affluent women. Their fortunes surpassed the wealth of other Spartans, including even the two Spartan kings, by orders of magnitude. In essence, they formed an independent political force. Not infrequently, some of the most powerful individuals in Sparta, including the monarchs themselves, found themselves entirely dependent on financial loans provided by Spartan heiresses. Their influence reached colossal proportions. From time to time, politicians in Sparta initiated discussions about the need for land reform, but each time, the Spartan heiresses decisively quashed such initiatives by flooding the system with financial flows and resorting to bribing politicians. The rest of Greece was astonished and shocked by the fact that such a small group of women wielded such unyielding control over the Spartan political arena. Aristotle explicitly expressed his displeasure with how wealthy Spartan wives typically dominated their less affluent husbands, and that the entire female population was corrupted by their intemperance and luxury. Thus, the Spartans, despite their colossal wealth, consistently perceived themselves as foreign occupiers, even centuries later. In their collective consciousness, they constantly felt on the brink of an abyss, of their civilization's complete destruction. For this reason, Spartan society placed exceptional importance on prophecies and omens. Dealing with a multitude of sometimes contradictory predictions could be an all-consuming task, so each king had two assistants tasked with overseeing this complex domain. If one of the kings needed to consult a regional oracle, such as the famous Delphic oracle, they would immediately send one of these trusted assistants to convey the question. In a sense, the kings served as the chief religious officials in the city-state. Their continuous presence served as a religious justification for Sparta's continued existence, which was a central and indispensable element of Spartan religious life. However, from a practical standpoint, the city continued to thrive and exist due to Sparta's exceptional and incredible military might. Strictly regulated, the kings were the only two individuals permitted to command Spartan armies. During a military campaign, one of the kings essentially transformed into an absolute monarch. His word became absolute law. He possessed unlimited power over the life and death of every Spartan citizen, and could even confiscate property if he deemed it necessary for successful military efforts. Spartan monarchs, while entitled to a share of all spoils captured during military operations, did not necessarily become immensely wealthy as a result. On the contrary, the royal office was a very costly endeavor. The rulers of Sparta regularly, and at times even obsessively, sought advice from oracles. Furthermore, they were invariably expected to present generous, truly royal gifts to the patron temple. Displaying stinginess or underestimating the sanctuary's importance would inevitably be seen as a direct insult to the deity it was dedicated to, which for the deeply superstitious Spartans was an utterly unthinkable transgression. Additionally, Spartan kings bore the burden of other significant, often overlooked financial obligations. During military campaigns, they had to bring a portion of their personal livestock for animal sacrifices before almost every important strategic or tactical decision. If, after the ritual sacrifice, the omens remained unfavorable, the king was forced to continue the rites, offering new sacrifices until the portents improved. The mass slaughter of such a large number of animals meant that the royal treasury was literally depleted during a campaign. Ritual animal sacrifices became such an integral and frequent practice that at a certain point, to guarantee a continuous supply of sacrificial animals for the kings, a special legislative act was passed, mandating the seizure of one piglet from each litter to replenish the monarch's personal herd. Their functions were limited exclusively to religious and military aspects. The management of state affairs was entirely entrusted to other officials. The individuals responsible for shaping Sparta's legislative framework held the title of ephors. The name itself translates to overseers, and the meaning of this designation becomes apparent upon further examination of their powers. In the Spartan state, there were 5 ephors, each required to be at least 45 years old, and their service lasted for precisely 1 year. Upon the expiration of their term, an ephor was permanently barred from holding the position again. While it's appropriate to use the term elected, it should be noted that the selection process itself was considerably more complex, and the full picture of its mechanisms remains unclear to this day. However, based on available data, it can be asserted that the Spartans, through a public vote, selected an unspecified number of candidates, and then 5 of these chosen contenders were randomly selected to serve as ephors for the current year. Thus, it is definitively known that the selection procedure included an element of randomness, but the precise degree of this randomization remains unknown. Whether there were 10 candidates on the list or perhaps 100, these details are lost to the depths of time. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle mentioned that this influential position often went to relatively poor Spartans, and if this assertion is true, the degree of randomness in the selection process could have been quite significant. At the beginning of the new Spartan year, immediately after taking office, the ephors commenced their first and highly symbolic ritual. They solemnly renewed Sparta's state of war against the Helots, conducting a complex and significant ceremony. This entire ritual served as a constant reminder to all Spartans that they were not the indigenous inhabitants of this land and that, theoretically, they were in a state of perpetual military conflict with their own slaves. In practice, however, the Spartans cynically used this formal state of war to justify various acts of cruelty and inhumanity towards the Helot population, who, by all accounts, gave no provocation for such treatment. So, after the ephors completed the distribution of Helots on their first day, their attention shifted to the main task that occupied them for the rest of the year, closely observing the activities of the Spartan kings. At the beginning of each new month, the 2 reigning kings and the 5 ephors gathered to exchange solemn oaths. The monarchs addressed the ephors with the words, "I will rule according to the established laws of the state." To which the ephors replied, "As long as you uphold your oath, we will maintain the royal power unshaken." What was implied by the phrase, "royal power unshaken"? The ephors possessed colossal authority and the right to exercise oversight. If a king's actions incurred their disapproval, they could initiate a vote, and by a simple majority of 3 votes to 2, formally accuse the monarch of committing a crime. In the event of such an accusation, a judicial process was immediately convened. The ephors took responsibility for collecting and subsequently presenting all necessary evidence, and then united with another influential body, the Gerousia, to jointly serve as jurors. If the king was found guilty, the range of possible punishments was very wide, from imposing a fine to complete deprivation of the crown and exile from Sparta. In the case of the extreme measure, exile, the royal crown simply passed to the next heir in line for the throne. It is important to remember that, according to Spartan beliefs, Heracles himself granted their kings the right to rule over this land. Thus, the removal of a king from power, although a very serious act, never led to a breach of the sacred line of succession. However, instances of kings being deposed were extremely rare. Even if a monarch found himself surrounded by a group of hostile ephors, he could count on their term expiring in just 1 year. Kings, demonstrating sufficient acumen, knew how to bide their time, remaining in the shadows until their opponents left office. However, in harsh wartime, Spartan kings could not afford to remain in the shadows. Their duty obliged them to be at the forefront, personally commanding Spartan armies. During these military campaigns, they were invariably accompanied by 2 ephors. The number 2 here was critically important. These 2 ephors had no right to act independently. They could not bring accusations against the king for committing a crime or in any way interfere with the direct conduct of military operations. Their main task was to meticulously record events and subsequently report their observations to the ephors who remained at home. Only after the completion of military operations could all ephors collectively conclude whether the monarch had exceeded his established powers. In peacetime, when Sparta was not involved in military conflicts, most of the ephors' efforts were focused on developing and shaping state policy. Votes on proposed initiatives were held among the 5 ephors, and a simple majority, meaning at least 3 votes, was required to approve any proposal. Notably, there were virtually no restrictions on the range of ideas they could propose. However, gaining approval from the College of Ephors did not yet guarantee that a proposal would automatically acquire the status of law. Discussions about taxes and state expenditures undoubtedly consumed a significant portion of their time, but debates on fundamental principles of morality and the maintenance of the traditional Spartan way of life were no less important. Once the ephors reached an agreement on a legislative act, they presented it for consideration to the assembly, composed of all adult male Spartan citizens. After hearing the proposed initiative, the Spartans expressed their opinion by oral vote, choosing between for or against. No amendments or discussions were permitted. The decision came down to a simple approval or rejection. Thus, to summarize the established system, it should be noted that the 2 kings served as both spiritual leaders and military commanders of Sparta. At the same time, the 5 ephors exercised comprehensive oversight and approved laws with the consent of the people. In addition, the ephors were responsible for many less significant, but no less important, aspects of state governance. It was they who determined who was allowed to enter and leave Spartan territory. This control extended to merchants, diplomats, and even curious chroniclers like Xenophon. Xenophon had the opportunity to spend several years in Sparta, forging a strong friendship with one of the reigning kings. However, even for him, the future in Sparta remained precarious and uncertain. Each year, new ephors came into power, and each time they reevaluated whether to allow this foreigner to continue living among the Spartans. The ephors were always significantly reluctant to send Spartans abroad, even if there were valid reasons for it. The reason for this was the consistent reputation of Spartans, who, when away from home, tended to indulge in wild and unrestrained behavior. This involved excessive drinking, gambling, promiscuity, and fighting, in short, true debauchery. Within their communities, Spartans observed their austere code of conduct with astonishing strictness, but once left to their own devices, all prohibitions seemed to lift. In addition to other duties, the ephors played a key role in shaping Sparta's younger generation. When young men reached maturity, these officials embarked on an important selection process. From among the graduates, the ephors carefully selected 3 young men whose qualities, in their deep conviction, surpassed those of their peers and who most fully embodied unwavering Spartan values. Each of these 3 chosen youths was then granted the right to independently select 100 of their peers. Each selection was subject to close scrutiny and thorough questioning by the ephors, ensuring compliance with the criteria. Upon completion of this multi-stage process, the 3 youths initially selected by the ephors assumed the duties of officers, and the hundreds they had chosen became their subordinates. Together, these groups formed the Royal Guard, intended to serve one of the Spartan kings. Upon the expiration of their 1-year term, the ephors immediately appeared before their successors. The purpose of this meeting was a comprehensive and detailed accounting for all actions and decisions made during their year in office. In fact, it was a strict official review, a kind of audit of their activities. In the event of abuse of power or exceeding authority, the new ephors had the full right to apply any penalties they deemed just and necessary to their predecessors. Although the random nature of the selection for the position of ephors and their limited 1-year term could potentially be a source of significant instability in the complex Spartan system of governance, it was this effective mechanism of subsequent review and strict accountability that effectively restrained the ephors from any attempts to make overly radical or destabilizing decisions. Perhaps at times, this restraint was even excessive. Known historical accounts concerning the activities of the ephors consistently contain one curious gap. They mention no significant legislative initiatives or achievements. Surprisingly, not a single such accomplishment is recorded in the annals. This absence can be explained by several hypotheses. One suggests that the annual official review procedure, conducted at the end of the term, might have inspired such fear that it hindered initiative. Another possibility is that such achievements did occur but for some reason were not documented. After all, the sources available to us are extremely fragmentary, and the completeness of our knowledge about that period leaves much to be desired, likely covering only a small part of reality. Finally, it is not excluded that the powers of the ephors were deliberately limited by some external influential group. It is this assumption of external limitations that logically leads us to consider the role of the Gerousia. This institution, known as the Gerousia, served as an important counterbalance, restraining the potentially excessive power of the ephors. The name, Gerousia, itself can be translated as Council of Elders, which accurately reflects the essence of this body. It consisted of 28 full members. They were joined by the 2 reigning kings, who held honorary seats in the Gerousia, bringing its official number of participants to 30. Besides the monarchs, election to the Gerousia required being a man over 60 years old, as well as possessing an impeccable reputation, demonstrating significant merits and achievements. However, despite these formal criteria, actual practice showed that almost all members of this council came from a very limited circle of Sparta's most affluent and influential families. Unlike the ephors, whose terms were time-limited, membership in the Gerousia was elective but lifelong. Upon the death of one of the Geronts, as members of the Gerousia were called, a fierce struggle for the vacant seat immediately began. Although absolute certainty on this matter is unattainable due to the incompleteness of historical data, a number of researchers lean towards the view that stable political factions formed around the 2 royal dynasties. Each of these factions sought to ensure the election of its protégé, making the election process very tense and competitive. So, what was the actual activity of the Gerousia? This influential body possessed the exclusive right to annul any decision that had been approved by the assembly of Spartan citizens. In other words, they effectively held veto power. Even though the ephors could draft legislative initiatives and Spartan citizens had the opportunity to approve them, the Gerousia could intervene at the last moment and declare, "No, this is unacceptable." Their powers extended even further. The Gerousia independently determined the agenda for each assembly meeting. This meant that even if the ephors had prepared many excellent laws, the Gerousia merely had to say, "No, this will not be on the schedule." Given that the ephors served for only 1 year, the Gerousia could easily block their activities until a new group was elected. As one can easily imagine, the Gerousia exerted a very significant conservative influence on the entire Spartan political culture. Any reforms were impossible without the consent of the Gerousia. In the voting process of the assembly of Spartan citizens, the Gerousia played a very peculiar role. Members of the Gerousia were located in a separate building, situated not far from the assembly's meeting place. The ephors presided over the assembly and presented their legislative proposals, while the people cast their votes. It is important to note that voting was conducted orally. The Gerousia, being at some distance, could not observe the proceedings but was able to perceive the sounds of the citizens' will. After the voting concluded, the members of the Gerousia came forward and proclaimed which side had shown greater vocal activity. The side that sounded louder won the vote. The idea was to maintain the appearance of impartiality for the Gerousia, yet they still retained the right to veto outcomes if they disapproved of anything. As has been repeatedly noted, when a king was on trial or a citizen faced charges for a serious crime like murder, the ephors and Gerousia jointly formed a 35-member jury panel. It is likely that, as honorary members of the Gerousia, kings could even sit on a jury in their own trial. The outcome of a case was determined by a simple majority vote, and given that the elected members of the Gerousia occupied 28 of the 35 seats on this jury, their influence was always decisive. Spartan kings preferred to consult informally with the Gerousia before making any significant decisions. This practice allowed the elders to feel important, and if the ephors ever decided to hold a king accountable, it was always reassuring to know that his actions had been agreed upon by the Gerousia. Sparta was inherently an extremely cautious and conservative state, and the Gerousia served as the primary institutional source of this prudence. Centuries after Sparta's decline, the Roman politician Cicero expressed deep admiration for the Spartan system. He was impressed by how kings were constantly aware of the possibility of their removal from office at any moment. He liked that the ephors were obliged to account for all their actions to their successors at the end of their term. He highly valued the power of the Gerousia and how these wise elders could balance competing interests or halt legislative initiatives if a situation spiraled out of control. Cicero considered this approach to institutional design incredibly stable, and as a conservative, he valued stability above all else. Xenophon shared this view, calling Spartan institutions and the stability they provided the cornerstone of its strength. Ultimately, it may have been excessive stability that proved fatal for Sparta. At the height of its power, this state was capable of fielding its entire male citizen population, forming an army of at least 20,000 warriors, and possibly more. However, a century and a half later, by the era of Alexander the Great, this formidable force had dwindled to a mere 1,000 men, with the reasons for such a drastic weakening still remaining a mystery. It was for this reason that Philip, Alexander the Great's father, could calmly disregard any threats from the Spartans. Another 150 years later, when the powerful Romans began actively interfering in the political affairs of Greece, Sparta was no more than an ordinary village, a kind of historical curiosity that nevertheless continued to exist under its traditional kings, ephors, and Gerousia, stubbornly adhering to its strict ancient customs. The true reasons for this rapid and inexplicable decline remain unknown to this day. However, it can be hypothesized that over the 3 centuries in question, just 1 or 2 key reforms could have initiated a revival and prevented its fatal weakening. Perhaps attracting new inhabitants from outside, starting from scratch, could have provided significant help. It's also possible that granting full citizenship to a certain number of Helot slaves would have strengthened the state. Or, perhaps, relaxing rigid rules regarding marriage could have been a path to renewal and preservation of Spartan society. Contrary to the Spartans' darkest fears, they never had to face overthrow at the hands of rebellious Helots, or a united coalition of enraged Hellenes. Instead, their decline followed a different scenario. They allowed their former power to gradually wither and atrophy. This ultimately led to their subjugation by a completely new wave of invaders who perceived the Spartans as nothing more than archaic oddities, like relics from a long past, more glorious era.